Steinberg Cubase 12 Pro. We start lesson 20. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, so as not to miss new videos. And we start lesson 20. Undoing recordings. You can undo a recording immediately after recording it. Procedure. Select Edit, Undo. Result. The events that you just recorded are deleted from the project window. The audio clips in the pool are moved to the trash folder. After completing this task, to remove the recorded audio files from the hard disk, select Media Open Pool window, right-click the trash icon and select Empty Trash. Related links. Pool window. Recording a mix of separate tracks. Recovery of audio recordings. Recovery of audio recordings. Cubase allows you to recover audio recordings. You can recover audio recordings in two situations. You hit record too late. For this to work, you must specify an audio pre-record time. The system failed during recording. Undoing recordings. Specifying an audio pre-record time. Specifying an audio pre-record time. You can capture up to 1 minute of any incoming audio that you play in stop mode or during playback. This is possible because Cubase can capture audio input in buffer memory, even when not recording. Procedure. In the Preferences dialog, select Record Audio. Specify a time, up to 60 seconds, in the Audio Pre-Record Seconds field. This activates the buffering of audio input, making pre-recording possible. Make sure that the audio track is record-enabled and receives audio from the signal source. When you have played some audio material that you want to capture either in stop mode or during playback, click Record. Stop the recording after a few seconds. This creates an audio event that starts where the cursor position was when you activated recording. If you were in stop mode, and the cursor was at the beginning of the project, you may have to move the event to the right in the next step. If you were playing along to a project, you can leave the event where it is. Select the Object Selection tool. Place the cursor on the bottom left edge of the event, so that a double arrow appears. Then click and drag to the left. Result. The event is now extended, and the audio that you played before activating the recording is inserted. This means that if you played along during playback, the captured notes end up exactly where you played them in relation to the project. Related links. Record, audio. Recovery of audio recordings. Recovery of audio recordings after system failure. Recovery of audio recordings after system failure. Cubase allows you to recover audio recordings after a system failure. When you experience a computer crash during a recording, relaunch the system, and check the project record folder. By default, this is the audio subfolder inside the project folder. It should contain the audio file that you recorded, from the moment when you started recording to the time when your computer crashed. Note: this feature does not constitute an overall guarantee by Steinberg. While the program itself is capable of recovering audio recordings after a system failure, it is always possible that a computer crash, power cut, etc. might have damaged another component of the computer, making it impossible to save or recover any of the data. Do not try to actively bring about this kind of situation to test this feature. Although the internal program processes are designed to cope with such situations, Steinberg cannot guarantee that other parts of the computer are not damaged as a consequence. Specifying an audio pre-record time. MIDI recording specifics. MIDI recording specifics. Specific preparations and settings are required for MIDI recordings. Related links. MIDI recording specifics. Recording in MIDI editors. MIDI record modes. Recovery of audio recordings after system failure. MIDI recording preparations. MIDI recording preparations. The preparations described in the following sections mainly focus on external MIDI devices. MIDI recording specifics. MIDI instruments and channels. MIDI instruments and channels. Most MIDI synthesizers can play several sounds simultaneously, each on a different MIDI channel. This allows you to play back several sounds, bass, piano, etc., from the same instrument. Some devices, such as general MIDI-compatible sound modules, always receive on all 16 MIDI channels. If you have such an instrument, you do not have to adjust any settings in the instrument. On other instruments, use the front panel controls to specify the number of parts, timbres, and the like, so that they all receive on one MIDI channel. For more information, refer to the manual that came with your instrument. MIDI recording preparations. Naming MIDI ports. Naming MIDI ports. MIDI inputs and outputs are often displayed with long and complicated names. In Cubase, you can rename your MIDI ports to more descriptive names. Procedure. Select Studio as Studio Setup. In the Devices list, select MIDI Port Setup. The available MIDI inputs and outputs are listed. On Windows, the device to choose depends on your system. Click in the Show As column and type in a new name. Click OK. Result. The new port names appear on the input routing on the output routing pop-up menus. MIDI instruments and channels. Setting the MIDI input. Setting the MIDI input. In the inspector, set the MIDI input for the track. Procedure. In the track list, select the track to which you want to assign a MIDI input. In the topmost inspector section, open the input routing pop-up menu, and select an input. The available inputs depend on the type of MIDI interface that you use. If you hold down Shift-Alt/Opt, the selected MIDI input is used for all selected MIDI tracks. Note: if you select all MIDI inputs, the track receives MIDI data from all available MIDI inputs. Naming MIDI ports. Setting the MIDI channel and output. Setting the MIDI channel and output. The MIDI channel and the output settings determine where the recorded MIDI is routed during playback. They are also relevant for monitoring MIDI in Cubase. You can select the channel and the output from the track list or in the inspector. Procedure. In the track list, select the track to which you want to assign a MIDI channel and an output. In the topmost inspector section, open the output routing pop-up menu and select an output. The available outputs depend on the type of MIDI interface that you use. If you hold down Shift-Alt/Opt, the selected MIDI output is used for all selected MIDI tracks. Open the channel pop-up menu and select a MIDI channel. Note: if you select any as the MIDI channel, the MIDI material is routed to the channels that are used by your MIDI instrument. Setting the MIDI input. Selecting a sound. Selecting a sound. You can select sounds from within Cubase by instructing the program to send program change and bank select messages to your MIDI device. Procedure. In the track list, select the track to which you want to assign a sound. In the track list or in the inspector, open the Program Selector pop-up menu and select a program. Program change messages give you access to 128 different program locations. If your MIDI instruments have more than 128 programs, you can open the Bank Selector pop-up menu and select different banks, each containing 128 programs. Note: bank select messages are recognized differently by different MIDI instruments. The structure and the numbering of banks and programs may also vary. Refer to the documentation of your MIDI instruments for details. Related links. MIDI Track Inspector. Setting the MIDI channel and output. Recording in MIDI editors. Recording in MIDI editors. You can record MIDI data into the MIDI part that is opened in a MIDI editor. Prerequisite. You have selected Merge or Replace as the MIDI record mode. Procedure. Click in the MIDI editor so that it gets the focus. In the MIDI editor toolbar, activate Record in Editor. Do one of the following to activate recording. Click Record on the Transport panel. Click Record on the toolbar. Result. The MIDI data is recorded into the MIDI part that is open in the MIDI editor. If you record outside the part borders, the part is automatically enlarged. Related links. Key Editor toolbar. Selecting a sound. MIDI recording. MIDI recording. To record MIDI, use any of the basic recording methods. When you finish recording, a part that contains MIDI events is created in the project window. Note: if you perform a live recording on a VST instrument, you usually compensate the latency of the audio card by starting to play earlier. As a consequence, the timestamps are recorded too early. If you activate ASIO latency compensation on the track list, all recorded events are moved by the current latency setting. The following preferences affect MIDI recording. Length adjustment. Snap MIDI parts to bars. MIDI record catch range in MS. ASIO latency compensation active by default. You can find them in the Preferences dialog on the MIDI and on the Record MIDI page. Related links. Basic recording methods. MIDI. Record, MIDI. Recording in MIDI editors. Types of MIDI messages. Types of MIDI messages. You can record different types of MIDI messages. To specify which event types are recorded, deactivate the options for the type of MIDI message that you want to record in the Preferences dialog, MIDI filter page. Related links. MIDI filter. MIDI recording. Note messages. Note messages. Cubase records note on, note off, and MIDI channel messages. If you press and release a key on your synthesizer or on another MIDI keyboard, the following messages are recorded. Note on, key down. Note off, key up. MIDI channel. Note: normally, the MIDI channel information is overridden by the MIDI channel setting for the track. However, if you set the track any as the MIDI channel, the notes is played back on their original channels. Types of MIDI messages. Continuous messages. Continuous messages. Pitch bend, aftertouch, and controllers, such as modulation wheel, sustain pedal, volume, etc. are considered continuous MIDI events, as opposed to the momentary key down and key up messages. You can record continuous messages with or separate from the notes, that is, afterwards or before. You can record continuous messages on their own tracks, separately from the notes to which they belong. As long as you set the two tracks to the same output and MIDI channel, the MIDI instrument identifies them as two simultaneously created recordings. Note messages. Program change messages. Program change messages. When you switch from one program to another on your synthesizer or on another MIDI keyboard, a number corresponding to that program is sent out as a program change message via MIDI. You can record program change messages with or separate from the notes, that is, afterwards or before. You can record program change messages on their own tracks, separately from the notes to which they belong. As long as you set the two tracks to the same output and MIDI channel, the MIDI instrument identifies them as two simultaneously created recordings. Continuous messages. System exclusive messages. System exclusive messages. SysX, system exclusive, messages are special types of MIDI messages that are used to send data that only make sense to a unit of a certain make and type. SysX can be used to transmit a list of the numbers that make up the settings of one or more sounds in a synth. Program change messages. Reset function. Reset function. The reset function sends out note-off messages and resets controllers on all MIDI channels. This is sometimes necessary if you experience hanging notes, constant vibrato, etc. when punching in and out on MIDI recordings with pitch bend or controller data. To perform a manual MIDI reset, select MIDI reset. If you want Cubase to perform a MIDI reset on stop, activate Reset on Stop in the Preferences dialog, MIDI page. If you want Cubase to insert a reset event at the end of a recorded part, activate Insert Reset Events after record in the Preferences dialog, MIDI page. This resets controller data such as sustain, aftertouch, pitch bend, modulation, and breath control. This is useful if a MIDI part is recorded and the sustain pedal is still held after stopping the recording. Usually, this would cause all following parts to be played with sustain, as the pedal off command was not recorded. Related links. MIDI. System exclusive messages. MIDI record modes. MIDI record modes. By selecting a MIDI record mode, you decide what happens to any existing parts on the track where you are recording. MIDI tracks can play back all events in overlapping parts. If you record several parts in the same locations or move parts so that they overlap, you will hear the events in all parts. Note: if you activate Record in Editor to record MIDI data in the editor, all new recordings are merged into the active part, and the MIDI record modes do not apply. To access the record modes, select Transport MIDI Record Mode. You can also access the MIDI record modes by clicking to the right of the MIDI symbol in the MIDI Recording Mode section on the Transport panel. MIDI record mode. New parts. Existing parts that overlap with a new recording are kept. The new recording is saved as a new part. Merge. Existing events in parts that overlap with a new recording are kept. The newly recorded events are added to the existing part. Replace. Existing events in parts that overlap with a new recording are replaced. MIDI cycle record mode. When you record MIDI in cycle mode, the result not only depends on the MIDI record mode, but also on the cycle record mode that is selected in the cycled MIDI recording only section. Mix. For each completed lap, everything you record is added to what was previously recorded. This is useful for building up rhythm patterns. Record a hi-hat part on the first lap, the bass drum part on the second lap, etc. Overwrite. As soon as you play a MIDI note or send any MIDI message, all MIDI that you have recorded on previous laps is overwritten from that point. Make sure that you stop playing before the next lap begins. Otherwise, you will overwrite the entire take. Keep last. Each completed lap replaces the previously recorded lap. If you deactivate recording or press stop before the cursor reaches the right locator, the previous take will be kept. If you do not play or input any MIDI during a lap, nothing happens, and the previous take is kept. Stacked. Each recorded cycle lap is turned into a separate MIDI part, and the track is divided into lanes, one for each cycle lap. The parts are stacked above each other, each on a different lane. All takes but the last one are muted. Mix stacked, no mute. Same as stacked, but parts are not muted. Related links. MIDI recording specifics. Recording in MIDI editors. Transport menu. Transport panel sections. Reset function. Automatic MIDI record quantize. Automatic MIDI record quantize. Cubase can automatically quantize MIDI notes on recording. Automatic MIDI record quantize is available in the MIDI auto quantize section of the transport bar. If you activate auto quantize, the notes that you record are automatically quantized according to the quantize settings. Related links. Quantizing MIDI and audio. Quantize panel. MIDI record modes. Recovery of MIDI recordings. Recovery of MIDI recordings. Cubase allows you to recover MIDI data, including controller data, that was captured in stop mode or during playback. The MIDI data is stored in the retrospective record buffer, and you can insert it as a MIDI part on the selected MIDI track. The buffer captures up to 10,000 MIDI events. This can amount to a MIDI recording of around 2 minutes and 30 seconds. However, if you use a keyboard that produces a large amount of MIDI controller events, such as the Rolly C-board, this only corresponds to a recording of around 20 seconds. Note: in the Preferences dialog, Record, MIDI page, you can specify a retrospective record buffer size. If the buffer is full, the MIDI events that were captured first are replaced by the new events. MIDI events in the buffer are also replaced in the following situations. You have inserted the retrospective recording on a track, and you play new events in stop mode or during playback. You play MIDI notes in stop mode, and you do not play for more than 30 seconds, before playing further MIDI events in stop mode. Note: you can also empty the buffer manually. Related links. Record, MIDI. Emptying the retrospective record buffer. Automatic MIDI record quantize. Inserting a retrospective recording from all MIDI inputs into the selected track. Inserting a retrospective recording from all MIDI inputs into the selected track. You can insert a retrospective recording, that is, MIDI data that was sent to all MIDI inputs in stop mode or during playback, into the selected track. Prerequisite. You have played MIDI notes in stop mode or during playback, and you want to recover them. Procedure. Select the MIDI track into which you want to insert the captured MIDI data. Select Transport MIDI Retrospective Recording Insert from all MIDI inputs. Result. The MIDI data that was captured at all MIDI inputs is inserted into the selected track as a single, linear MIDI part. Note: if you insert buffer data from multiple selected tracks, the timing offsets between the data played on the different tracks are retained. Note: if your MIDI track uses MIDI inserts and record output to track is enabled in the MIDI inserts section, the buffer data includes the events that are created by the MIDI inserts. Related links. Recording a MIDI insert effect. MIDI inserts. Recovery of MIDI recordings. Inserting a retrospective track recording. Inserting a retrospective track recording. You can insert a retrospective track recording, that is, MIDI data that was sent to the track input in stop mode or during playback, into the selected track. Prerequisite. You have played MIDI notes in stop mode or during playback, and you want to recover them. Procedure. Select the MIDI track into which you want to insert the captured MIDI data. In the top section of the MIDI track inspector, click Retrospective Recording. From the pop-up menu, select one of the following. To insert the MIDI data as one continuous MIDI part, select Insert as Linear Recording. To insert the MIDI data as stacked MIDI parts, select Insert as Cycle Recording. Note: this is only available if your MIDI data was captured during playback, and if cycle mode was active. Result: the MIDI data that was captured at the track input is inserted into the track. Note: if the data was captured during playback, it is inserted at the position where you played it. If the data was captured in stop mode, it is inserted at the project cursor position. Inserting a retrospective recording from all MIDI inputs into the selected track. Inserting a retrospective track recording into an editor. Inserting a retrospective track recording into an editor. You can insert a retrospective track recording, that is, MIDI data that was sent to the track input in stop mode or during playback, into the MIDI part that is open in a MIDI editor. Prerequisite. You have played MIDI notes in stop mode or during playback, and you want to recover them. Procedure. Double-click the MIDI part where you want to insert the captured MIDI data to open it in a MIDI editor. On the MIDI editor toolbar, click Insert MIDI Retrospective Recording in Editor. Result: the MIDI data that was captured on the track input is inserted into the MIDI part. If the data was captured during playback, it is inserted into the MIDI part along the timeline. If the data was captured in stop mode, it is inserted at the project cursor position. Inserting a retrospective track recording. Emptying the retrospective record buffer. Emptying the retrospective record buffer. You can empty the retrospective record buffer manually. Procedure. Do one of the following. In the top section of the MIDI track inspector, open the retrospective recording pop-up menu, and select Empty Retrospective Record Buffer. Select a track, and select Transport the MIDI retrospective recording to empty all buffers. Inserting a retrospective track recording into an editor. Remaining record time.